Hello, everybody. My name is Eddie Huffman. I write for the News and Record and the Winston-Salem Journal and some other local publications, national publications. Here with Dr. Michael White from New Orleans.
Hello, how's it going there?
I understand this is not your first trip to the National Folk Festival.
No, not at all, but I do a lot of festivals, and this is right at the top of my favorite.
Great. So this is the third or fourth?
Yeah, it's the third or fourth. I haven't figured out whether it's the 3 or 4 yet. But,
all right. Well, I remember several years ago there was a CD box set called Doctors and Professors, Kings and Queens, the big box set of New Orleans. And I understand you are one kind of doctor and two kinds of professors, if I'm not mistaken. I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Well, yeah, I remember that CD set. I said, boy, I'm almost everything on here except for the Queen part. But, yeah, I have a doctorate in Spanish, and I was a college professor at Xavier University in New Orleans. For 25 years I taught Spanish. I'm actually still at Xavier, but now I teach African American music. I've been teaching that now for about 20 years. And I was blessed about a dozen years ago with an endowed chair in the humanities. And so I teach that one class, and I developed a series called the Culture of New Orleans series, and every semester we present some aspect of New Orleans history and culture that you won't get to see anywhere else, and we open that up to the public, and we've been doing well with that series. So
Great. And you grew up in the city?
Yeah, I was born in New Orleans and been there all my life, except for when I had to evacuate for Katrina. So yeah, I was native New Orleanian all the way. Yes.
Were you exposed to a good bit of the culture as a child? Was it something you grew up being a part of?
Well, when you come up in New Orleans, music is everywhere. And, what I heard a lot of when I first started out was not actually traditional jazz, but I heard a lot of early rhythm and blues. I lived right around the corner from Fats Domino.
Oh, nice.
And I went to school with some of his kids, and his house was a block away from the school. So you would hear people playing as you walk down the street. You would hear Fats Domino records all through the house. Yeah. I'd get home and my mother would be playing Fats Domino records. And I knew about that. And then, you would hear music. Sometimes I would hear brass bands and parades and things like that.
And has clarinet always been your instrument?
Yes. I started in high school, and I had private lessons for almost 4 years. Played in the symphonic band and the marching band in New Orleans at St. Augustine High School. So we have a very prominent marching band called the Marching 100. So I was in that band, yes.
Okay. Let's see. Well, I know you kind of celebrate the tradition of early New Orleans music these days. Can you tell me how you gravitated toward that style of music?
Well, it's kind of a spiritual thing, but I was very blessed when I came up and started getting interested in the music in my late teens. There were still dozens and dozens of older musicians that were still playing the music that they had always played. And there were older brass band musicians. And I ended up being in the right place at the right time and catching the tail end of those two things, when the authentic brass band tradition was still very traditional in terms of music and function and style. And I was in brass bands for about 4 years, played a lot of jazz funerals, social club parades, church parades, other community type functions. And then 4 years later, I joined the Musicians Union and met up with another set of older musicians that were still very active, recording, touring. But altogether, I counted, and it's hard for me to believe, but there were over 36 musicians that were born between the late 1890s and 1910 that I had a lot of contact with, that I played with for many years. And these musicians became my friends, and a lot of them were like relatives to me.
Yeah. Well, I noticed you have a banjo in your band. You play clarinet, obviously. Can you talk about, is that some traditional instrumentation from the early music in New Orleans?
Oh yeah, the banjo is a very important instrument in early New Orleans jazz. Of course, the banjo is originally of African origin, and the banjo was popular in New Orleans even back in the early days of Congo Square, you know, in the early 19th century, but even before that, the slaves recreated string instruments, and they played those along with drums and everything in Congo Square in New Orleans. And the banjo kind of replaced the guitar as the main string instrument in New Orleans dance bands during the early days of jazz, because dancing had become so popular and guitar was just, you know, these were the days before amplification, so the guitar wasn't loud enough. The banjo is a dangerous weapon. Banjo can be played very loudly. It will cut through anything. So they started using banjos in early jazz, and that became a standard part of the music. So all of the great early jazz recordings have banjos on them.
Okay. How did things evolve away from the banjo into more sort of big band, more brass? How did that evolve? Can you talk a little bit about that process?
Well, you mean in jazz in general?
In jazz, yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, what happened is as the music moved outside of New Orleans, its main function away from the city was as dance music, and as the music got to Chicago, but also New York especially. It was in Chicago, it was played in a lot of clubs as well as entertainment music, but more and more jazz was used for dancing, and so people started to make changes with dance orchestras. They started to use larger size groups, not have everyone improvising. Yeah. They started to write out parts, and you know, you had sections. Instead of one reed instrument, you had a reed section. Instead of one trumpet, you had, you know, a trumpet section or a brass section with several trombones and trumpets. And so, you know, there were musicians like Fletcher Henderson and Don Redman that really developed that style, which changed jazz into a more formal setting where different sections of instruments would play off against each other using written parts. And then they would have occasional improvised solos interspersed between. So that kind of changed things up. Now, even in the early bands, like the early Don Redman, early Duke Ellington even, they did use banjos for a while. But in general, what happened was the rhythm section of what became big bands was smoother. They kind of made it a little smoother and softer. And so the guitar was kind of right for that. So they either used guitar, and eventually some bands didn't use guitar at all, but a lot of them used the guitar and kind of softened out the sound. So it lost its popularity in you know, later styles of jazz, big band and later.
You were talking about knowing some of the guys from the early days of New Orleans, dating back to the late 19th century. Who did they play with? Who were some of the big names of that era? Well,
I mean, it's surprising, but a lot of the guys that I knew and played, and some of them recorded with, I mean, the biggest names in New Orleans jazz: Jelly Roll Morton, King Oliver, Louis Armstrong, Sidney Bechet, Johnny Dodds, Jimmy Noon. And the great thing about it, when I was coming up and trying to learn about the music, I would read history books and I would listen to recordings, but then I had these guys there actually saying what it was like to hear these guys in person and how they were different from the records, you know, what they really sounded like, how you know, the recordings didn't quite capture the right sound or feeling, or how King Oliver really played in a club as opposed to what's on those recordings, you know. So it gave me a much more complete sense of what the music was, as opposed to just having records and books.
Absolutely. Did you get some good stories out of those guys? What kind of places would they play?
I had a million stories. Some of them I cannot tell. I've heard a lot of stories. One story, Danny Barker used to tell me about Jelly Roll Morton. When he moved up to New York, he was a banjo and guitar player. And in the late 1920s and early 30s, well, really in the early 30s, he started to play with Jelly Roll Morton on pickup jobs. Jelly Roll would book parties, and those parties would be at private houses or sometimes on boats that would, you know, take little cruises in the evenings. So he would tell me about some of those different kind of functions. And you know how Jelly Roll Morton was around New York. He would stand on the corner outside of this famous club known as the Rhythm Club and fuss all day about how other musicians like Duke Ellington and others were stealing his style and not giving him compensation, and how he invented jazz and how all the big band music came from him. so that's one of the things I can tell. But no, a lot of the musicians had stories, and some of those stories are really, really funny. Now, the oldest musician I played with was Kit Thomas Valentine, and he was born in 1896.
Okay.
He was a trumpet player. So he was born 5 years before Louis Armstrong, and he had his own style and own voice, as most of those musicians did. And it was really a great experience because you don't see people that are like that anymore. It seems like he was from a different era and different space. He had a different look, a different way of thinking, a different way of talking, and certainly his music was different. So it was great to be around that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, with your band today, how much do you try to sort of recreate or preserve those traditions and kind of expand and take them into new places?
Well, that's an interesting question because a lot of people, and I guess it's true of people that played New Orleans jazz, other places. A lot of people say, you go back and you find this old music, but actually when I started playing, I was just playing the music that these older guys were playing. They were still playing, so I didn't have to go back. I mean, it was right there, and they were right there. And it was continuous, in other words. There had been a line of continuity since the origin of jazz, and many of us are descendants or relatives of early generation musicians. So it's like we're all family in a way. And, my trumpet player up here is a descendant. My regular trombone player is descended from a jazz family. I come from an early jazz family. So, we learned this music from the older guys, and, we just kept on playing. So what we do now, I mean, we're not recreating or copying anything. I mean, we're just playing. We're just playing the music. And so, the way we play is not set in stone. I mean, we're improvising. So, like, for example, we had a set a little earlier out here, and on one of my songs, it just came to my mind to play a little something I heard this group playing on the set before us. They were playing a certain kind of pentatonic scale, and so I just kind of let that happen, and it was just something new. But sometimes we'll key in on, the weather or people we see out there or certain things, and that'll affect what comes out. So every time we play the music, it's always different. We never play a song the same way twice.
Nice.
We're not trying to sound like the 20s or King Oliver. We're trying to sound like ourselves.
Okay. Well, you were talking about coming from a jazz family. What sort of tradition was there in your own family, personal family?
Well, that's a strange thing. I didn't know about my relatives in jazz until I was in it, but I have several cousins that go back to the earliest days of jazz, to Buddy Bolden, who's considered to be the first jazz musician. And it's documented, but there was a barber shop on the corner from Buddy Bolden's house where he used to hang out, and my relatives bought the barber shop during the last 2 years that Bolden was active, and they used to have musicians gather there, but they were also musicians. So one of my relatives was a bass player named Papa John Joseph, and he had a brother named Willie Joseph that played clarinet, and they had another cousin named Earl Fouché, and all of these guys recorded in the late 1920s. Earl Fouché recorded with Sam Morgan on some classic recordings, the first recorded hymns in the New Orleans jazz style. So Earl Fouché is on that. Willie Joseph played clarinet, recorded with Louis Dumaine's Jazzola 8. And Papa John Joseph ended up not really recording until the 50s, but he recorded with some well-known musicians, Kid Thomas Valentine and George Lewis. And in 1963, Papa John Joseph made a historic tour of Japan for 3 months with George Lewis, and he became a standout there. But he recorded quite a lot, and for a long time, he was the oldest living jazz musician. But there are other relatives in other genres in the family, too. I'm pretty sure some of you might not recognize their names, but you've certainly heard some of what they've done. One of my cousins is a guy named Reno Richard. He wrote the first hymn that Ray Charles ever had. First hit that Ray Charles ever had, I Got a Woman. And the reason I probably said hymn was because it was kind of borrowed from a hymn.
He took a lot of heat for that at the time.
Yes, he did. He did. But, my cousin is still living. He's 90 years old, and he's still getting royalty checks. So he's doing well. Yeah. And another relative in the family is a jazz saxophonist named Plas Johnson. And you might not recognize that name, but Plas Johnson was a saxophonist with Henry Mancini, and it is he that is playing the saxophone solo and the melody on the Pink Panther and on Peter Gunn. And so every time you hear that, that's it right there.
Some of the best known sax lines ever recorded.
Right,
sure.
right. So, you know, all of those people are relatives, and they got into other things. But, you know, there were several of my relatives into traditional music. And then I have about 3 or 4 cousins today that are active, and most of them play traditional jazz as well.
Okay. Any other clarinet players in the family?
Well, no, the older generation, but not the younger guys.
Yeah.
Strangely enough, Papa John played a little clarinet, his brother Willie did, and Earl Fouché did as well. So, you know, it was kind of strange to me after I had gotten into this, to find out not only that I had all these relatives, but that they all at some point played clarinet as well.
Yeah. Well, speaking of hymns, I know you have a spiritual component to your music. You've recorded some gospel music. Can you talk a little bit about that side of your work?
Yeah, well, you know, a lot of people think that New Orleans jazz is a repertoire of songs, but more than a repertoire, it's a style that can be applied to many genres of music. So in early jazz, the most common song types that you see are blues, marches, rags from ragtime, and hymns, church hymns. And as I mentioned, in 1927, Sam Morgan's band recorded 4 hymns, and those were the first recorded hymns, but they standard, like Baptist type hymns, became a part of the New Orleans jazz tradition. So on almost every performance, we play some type of hymns. We also use hymns quite a lot in our jazz funeral tradition. Jazz funerals still go on in New Orleans. My first job this year was a jazz funeral. I did an estimate. My career is kind of long. It's like 41 years. And in that time, I estimated I did close to 200 jazz funerals.
Wow.
So we play hymns in those funerals. And I've also written a couple of hymns that I've recorded. One is entitled Dancing in the Sky, and that's the title of one of my CDs. I did that. And then I wrote another hymn called Sunday Morning, after Katrina, as kind of a message to the people of New Orleans to come together to help rebuild the city. And so we play hymns quite a lot. And I think on the set we have coming up, we probably will do a hymn, at least one.
Okay.
Yes.
We talked a little bit about Katrina before we started. It sounds like you were hit pretty hard by it. You were displaced. How have things changed for you and for the city since Katrina?
Well, it's been 11 years since the hurricane, 2005, Hurricane Katrina, devastated New Orleans. And 80% of the city flooded. And so there were many, many thousands of people who lost everything. I was one of them. Many people were displaced. Some of them are still displaced. There are tens of thousands of people who have not returned, and there are tens of thousands of others who are still, 11 years later, trying to rebuild their lives. And so many of us are in various stages of rebuilding, and so am I. I got a new home about 4 or 5 years ago, and I've been slowly rebuilding. I had a tremendous archive and collection of recordings, books, jazz memorabilia, instruments. So all of those things were completely destroyed because I had 8 feet of water in my house that stayed for up to 3 weeks, and that destroyed everything, you know. So, but the thing is, you know, what I realized, and it's one of the reasons I wrote the song, is that, you know, our jazz funeral tradition teaches us about how to make a transition to another type of existence, and to do so optimistically. And I really started to listen to that and believe in that concept and realize that, you know, despite all the losses, I still have the music, and I'm very thankful for that, because that's the most valuable thing I have.
Very nice. Where do you play these days? What are some of the venues you play in New Orleans?
Well, we travel and play all over the world, but in
Sure.
New Orleans, I do a lot of private engagements, but I play at this club on Frenchman Street called the Snug Harbor. It's one of my favorite places to play. And the Snug Harbor is really a modern jazz club, but we're the only real traditional jazz band that plays there, and we do very well when we do. I have the whole 7-piece group, and we played, in fact, 2 Saturdays ago there. And I play at Snug Harbor maybe once a month or every 6 weeks or so. And then there's another club that's newer, but in a very historic block on Rampart Street called the Little Gem Saloon. And I play there maybe about once a month or so as well.
Okay. And I believe you have at least a couple more performances coming up here at the Folk Festival?
Yes, we have a performance later this evening, and then we have another one tomorrow. And then a couple of the guys in my band are going to join some musicians of other styles, and we're going to have a session together.
Oh, nice.
So looking forward to that.
When
yes.
is that happening? Do you know?
I'm not sure of the time, but it's tomorrow. It's a later set.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, I think that's good for me. Any questions from the audience?
Okay. Someone had a question? Yes, sir.
Good to see you. How can we work, those of us who appreciate jazz, help to try to convey interest in jazz to our family, friends, other people? Some people just don't take it.
Right. Well, one of the things I find with people, younger people, when they hear the music, they like it, they dance to it. We play all over the world. But one of the things I find, and I find this in teaching also, it's a matter of exposure, and people are not exposed to the music. So, I mean, there are a number of ways you can do that. You can buy our recordings, and which we have out here by the city stage. But you can also, nowadays you can turn on YouTube and put on classic, talk to people about the meaning of jazz. Jazz is not just a fun dance music as it originally was, but in its original incarnation, jazz was really like an exercise in American democracy. Jazz was born in a very difficult, racially turbulent time, like if we don't have those kind of things today. But jazz was born, and it was a metaphor, in a sense, for freedom of expression, which is shown by, free improvisation. It was a way of allowing for incorporating and including diversity of ideas, not only of individuals, but musical styles and components from other cultures as well. And, it also allowed for people to come together, unity, collective improvisation. It promoted the individual, but it also promoted the group and teamwork. And so in a way, it's a collective exercise in democracy. And in New Orleans, we have these large social club parades, and there are brass bands that are in them, and people come to those parades, and they follow the parade for its entire duration, hours, and they dance, and they become an important part of the parade. So, I think sometimes the message of the music is important as well, but it serves as an important metaphor today for people to learn how to work with others as a team, but also how to find your own individuality. And that's the greatest lesson I learned from the older musicians, was that each one of them, some of them had different levels of musical training, some could read, some couldn't read music, but they all were very much developed individuals, and they learned how to take an instrument and make it sound not like a trumpet or a clarinet, but like their own personality. They each had their own sound, and when you study music, you don't necessarily get that concept. You're learning how to read notes, you're learning technique, you're learning the proper way of playing as such. But that level of individuality they had was like having your own handwriting, or your individual facial features or your fingerprints. I mean, they developed it that way, and it was an incredible thing. So that helped me quite a lot.